Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined by author and journalist Miguel Pereira. Miguel, thank you very much for coming on the show today. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Hi, Rory. Great to be here. I'm such a fan of the show, so wonderful to be sharing stories with you about Portuguese football and those forgotten clubs of old.
It's such high praise, Miguel. Thank you very much. It's fantastic to finally have you on. Miguel's been a fan and a friend of the show for quite some time. Before we kick things off today, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Well, basically, I'm a football writer and journalist. I've been doing this for almost like 20 years. I'm from Porto in Portugal, although I lived like almost 2 decades in Madrid in Spain, so I've covered all regarding the Iberian Peninsula. And I've been writing football books in Portuguese and Spanish, and recently this year, Pitch published my first book in English about Portuguese football. What else? Called "Bring Me That Horizon," which covers basically the identity and the soul and the history of Portuguese football. It was a theme that hadn't been touched really in literature in British literature, and I'm a consumer of football books, like you can see because we're having a camera, so you can see I have hundreds of football books in several languages, but there was no books about Portuguese football, and it always strange me because we are an important nation in regarding football, not only European wide but internationally as well. And we had great teams in the past, great players, great managers, but people never passed above the surface of the Mourinhos, the Cristiano Ronaldos, the Eusebios, the Porto Benfica Sporting rivalry. So I wanted to write a book that explained that, but much more. And that's why we ended up connecting and now talking about one of the clubs that is featured in the book as well.
Exactly. I've not had the chance to read Bring Me That Horizon yet. It's as I said to you this week, I was planning on picking it up so that I could do a bit more in-depth research. So I'm definitely going to order it after we've had this conversation so I can get my hands on it finally. But I completely agree with you. I found it really strange that there was this sort of deficit, if you like, of Portuguese history written in English for such an important footballing nation as well. As you mentioned, you've had so many talents coming through Portugal. Some of the most capped players in world football history and some of the most talented have come through the Portuguese system and the leagues. And yeah, it was just a bit strange to me that there wasn't a little bit more written on it. But of course, you had Glory magazine as well, who are one of my favourite footballing publications. Honestly, if you haven't checked these guys out, then please do so. Their content and their print is absolutely incredible. They done an issue on Portugal and talking about Benfica's £1 billion academy and the cafe where Eusebio used to eat, and it was just a fantastic read. And I urge anyone to please, if you haven't done so already, dive more into Portuguese football, past and present, because it's absolutely phenomenal, and the passion showed by some of the people there is just incredible. It's a true footballing nation. But today we're going to be talking about one of the clubs from Portugal's past. They have changed names quite a few times, and they've had quite an interesting, if checkered, history. We're going to be talking about Club União. Sorry, can you tell me how to say it again? I'll edit that out.
Well, the club is called CUF, which means Clube União Fabril, and it's the only time Portugal had a football club on the sorts of what we have now with, Salzburg, RB, Wolfsburg, Bayer Leverkusen, even Juventus. That means a company club. Basically, football clubs in Portugal are association clubs. They belong to the club members, most of them. Over the last few years, some of them become PLCs as well, although clubs usually have the majority of stocks. And in the case of Hoof, it was a club that was created in the 1930s because one of the most important, if not the most important, industrial company of Portugal, its owner decided that it was a good idea to create a sports club for employees. So basically, they founded the club to play several sports, not only football, but they during the 19 at least most of all after 1955 when they were promoted to the first division on a second time. They had been there in the 40s, they went back, then they climbed up the stairs again until the 1974 April democratic revolution. They were one of the big teams in Portuguese football. They played European Cups, they beat AC Milan, they won the Intertoto Cup before UEFA put their hands on it, and basically it's a club with a lot of history that simply disappeared out of the map because of that revolution that we're going to talk also about. So basically, it's a club that is super important in the history of Portuguese football for the period between the 40s and the 70s, and now it's a much missed club in the elite.
Yeah, I think you're right in saying that it's kind of like the Red Bull of Portuguese football, obviously going back a bit to the modern era when Red Bull clubs have popped up. But there's quite a lot of political and social context to this as well, because, as you mentioned there, that they were founded as a team, effectively a works team, pretty much, a team for employees of one of the biggest companies within Portugal. And what's interesting is that normally when you have work teams, as we saw in Spain and England and across Europe, is that more often than not, a lot of them will kind of remain at the level of being a works team. Others may evolve, such as Birmingham City, Aston Villa, etc., etc. But for example, in Ireland, you had a football club that was linked to the national transport. You had one like that in Glasgow as well. You have others that are related to factory teams. And more often than not, they kind of just remain at the level that they're at. But CUF ended up becoming bigger than they possibly could ever have imagined. But there's always going to be that asterisk next to the name of, well, actually, when you look a little bit deeper, there's a lot more to it than just that. So I think the best place would be to start at the very beginning, which is when they were founded in 1937, I believe.
Yeah, basically, Kuf was a company that was built by one of Portugal's main entrepreneurs, one of their main industrial figures. Portugal, to put in context, is always been and probably always going to be a poor country. So basically, it's a country where the Industrial Revolution arrived really late in the early 20th century, with like 30 to 40 years delay for many of their continental neighbors, Spain, France, Germany, Italy. And it came under the hands of this man called Alfredo da Silva. He was the son of a merchant family from Lisbon, a well-to-do family. He was brought up in France, and when his father died, he was forced to come back to Portugal to take the realms of the company. And he had been in France for so long that when he came back to Portugal, it was a shock for him to understand that Portugal was so underdeveloped. So he started to suggest several improvements. He was the first guy to implement a tram in Lisbon. He also helped develop the railway lines between some of the most important cities in Portugal. And essentially, he built the company União Fabril. It was the first company near Lisbon that would produce shipyards. Several canning industries were connected to it as well. And basically, it was an area on the left bank of the River Tagus. Of course, Lisbon is a beautiful city on the right bank of the Tagus, which is the Iberia's largest river. And the south bank was used until the 1920s, 30s for pasture because it was a very dry land. And basically, he bought a lot of the lands around a town called Barreiro. And he started to implement its company there, started to build factories around it. Poor people from the outskirts started to live around the factories. So they work and they live in the area. And basically that started to happen during the 1910s, 20s. At the same time, Portugal was having troubles politically because monarchy was abolished in 1910. He was a monarch, Alfredo da Silva. It was replaced by a republican model, but the republican model was, like many of those governments in the 1920s, very fragile politically because they always had to mingle between the socialist left and the right wing parties. So basically, he became a supporter, a hardcore supporter of the fascist regime that was starting to sprinkle in Italy first and in Germany. And basically, there was a military coup in Portugal in 1926, and he was one of the backers, one of the financial backers for the coup, because he was very interested in having a right wing regime in Portugal so he could have free hand on his companies. He was a man that was known to be totally against trade unions, totally against the 8-hour work labor. He wanted his workers basically to work like slaves, modern slaves. And when Salazar, who became the prime minister of Portugal for almost 40 years, was appointed prime minister, he was done so with the help of him in the shadows, would say. And basically, he started to concede him a lot of licenses so that their companies would have free trade to implement a lot of economic measures that would allow Barreiro community to grow and to outfast every and single industrializing point in Portugal. Doing so, he became a very popular figure in the area because he brought jobs, he brought money to people who were very impoverished. And in return, many of the workers requested them to create a sports club so they can use their spare time to do some sporting activities because they had no capability to cross the river. There was no bridge from the left bank to the right bank of Lisbon until the 1960s. So to cross the river, they had to go by boat. It was a travel that would take some time. So instead of going to Lisbon, and it was expensive as well, so they wanted to create a community on the left bank. And they asked him for the creation of a sports club sponsored by the company. And he finally agreed to in that year. And it was a club that included not only football, but also cycling, rowing, hockey, activities that were very popular back in the day. And basically, that's where the club began. What made the club different from all other worker teams back in the day was that his connection with Salazar, his connection with the regime, made him be able to attract a lot of top class players that would never in their lives play for the club. It soon began from a workers' club to a club of people who actually work in the company, but they were professionals in disguise. What we would do was to hire football players to work on the offices, basically, and they would give him a contract. They would give him a salary, was very top of the mark regarding the reality of Portuguese football. Professionalism was only allowed in 1959 in Portugal, so it was an uncover professionalism. So we would hire them for the company, and then they would play football. So basically, that's what set the company to sponsor the club. It was a way for him to also gain respectability and to gain more recognition for being the man who led a club that was supposedly a workers' club into the dream he had to become national champions. They never went that high, but they were on occasions really near of the possibility of fighting for the football league, which was also a miracle. If you see how Portuguese football has been going on for years, there's only 5 champions in its history, and 2 of them were only once: Belenenses in the 40s, Boa Vista in 2000. So basically, it was a Herculean task for CUF to be champions, but he tried his best.
I think that's quite a good snapshot into the full story, really, and I hope it gives the listeners an idea anyway of the type of thing that was going on here, because, you know, as you mentioned, it was this big hit. It was a massive, massive task, and obviously a massive achievement for CUF to end up where they did, and what they ended up achieving, and as you said, almost becoming champions for a club of that size, basically from just kind of maybe not even a suburb, but just an area or a region of Lisbon is incredibly
Yeah.
impressive. But obviously, and I don't know how you feel about this, but in my mind, with clubs like this, there always has to be this sort of caveat that, well, actually, though, instead of having to really go out and work for it like everyone else has, they just had this giant cash injection pretty much straight off the bat. And one of the things that you mentioned there as well is quite interesting, because it relates to what happened in a lot of the early days of the Scottish Football League, where basically a lot of clubs, and some clubs like St Bernard's probably the best example, they ended up getting banned and not re-elected from the league, and they ended up folding because of it. They never came back. Basically, footballers were being paid underhand, or, you know, under the counter, if you want to say, because in those days football in Scotland wasn't professionalised, it was still amateur. But people who owned football clubs would say, well, if you come and work in my factory, I'll pay you more than everyone else, but you can also play for the works team. So, you know, there was all this kind of thing going on. And it sounds like it was something similar at CUF, where the best players in the league, or the best potential talents, were being given lucrative contracts at the factory as well. They would have been given bonuses, maybe like a car or something like that, or better accommodation for them and their family to live in. And it's all because this guy had the money to be able to do it. And I suppose that's the caveat, isn't it? But they basically assembled one of the best teams in Portuguese football, and took them to heights that they never thought they would have ever been to. But of course, there has always kind of got to be that caveat, hasn't there?
Well, actually, for people who weren't in favor of the regime, they had a word for it. They call them cheaters, basically, because that's what they were in the context of the time. But there's also a lot of context to be added to the situation. First, of course, Portugal was a dictatorship. So basically, if you were in good terms with the dictator in turn, that was Salazar, then there was no foul play, because basically they were the ones doing the rules. Salazar loaded the game. He hated football. He was a guy who only approved for gymnastics as a sport. So basically, everything related to football for him was itching. He had a terrible fear of the power of the mob that football could produce. So basically, he never went to see a match. He was never interested in developing Portuguese football. That's why, in some ways, Portuguese football was so a late developer state until the 1980s when they started to really compete at the international level and to win trophies. And Alfredo Silva explored that because he knew Salazar wouldn't matter if he do it his way, because basically it wasn't like Mussolini, who was a guy also a fascist dictator, but he was much into football, so he wanted to know everything about it. He started a football club in Rome by assembling several small clubs into a bigger club that is AS Roma. So Salazar was the opposite, and Alfredo knew he had to do that. And at the same time, the region where CUF is, the Barreiro region, became known as one of the best football regions in Portugal. And from the 1940s until the 1970s, there was also three or four other teams from the region on a scope of like 50 kilometers that were from around in the first division. So basically, you had Vitória Setúbal, was the most important club of those days in the land. It was a club that has been in 10 cup finals. They won several. They played for the title in some seasons at the late 60s, early 70s. That's the club of Jose Mourinho, of course. His father was a goalkeeper for that iconic side of the 60s. That's a club he supports and where he grew up as a supporter and also as a youth player. Then you had clubs from other cities on that, what was known as Steel Belt, because basically after Barreiro started to industrialize the region, other small towns were benefited from it. So smaller companies started to locate there as well because it was more practical to provide services to the shipyards, to provide service for the canning industries. So towns like Montijo, like Seixal, like Amora, like Almada, who were just small villages, grew around that steel belt, and they tapped a lot of talented players. If you look at the history of Portuguese football, that is probably the region where most talented players have come through the years. Luis Figo was born in Almada. Paulo Futre was born in Montijo. João Cancelo is also from Almada, for instance. Ruben Dias grew up in Almada as well. You had a lot of international players from the 60s and 70s who were also from Seixal, from Barreiro, from that area. So basically, you didn't have to go and travel 200 kilometers north to find talent and bring him to his company, which he also did. But he also had a lot of youth talent available around. And most of those kids at the time were sons of workers, basically. And they knew that their fathers were also from impoverished families. So the possibility of signing for the club, to work in the factory, even if it was a fake contract, and to play for the team was the best possible for their lives. It was like a golden contract for them, like going to Saudi Arabia, basically. So for them, it was a very optimistic move. But at the same time, the steel belt around Lisbon, despite being created by a fascist, was the point where communism entered Portugal. Because basically, when you have factories, when you have workers, you start to have trade unions. Of course, they were forbidden, but there were undercover trade unions trying to help a little bit supporters. So basically, in the same town of Barreiro, already existed another club called Barreirense, and that was the left wing club, basically. So the rivalry between CUF and Barreirense was mythical. Of course, Barreirense competed in the first division, played European football. They were also a very accomplished team, but people were afraid of supporting them because they knew if they're going to be seen in the stadium of Barreirense, the political police, the Salazar regime would tap them as left wingers, as communists, as socialists, and of course they were afraid to go to jail. So a lot of people from Barreiro actually supported Barreirense, but went to see the CUF matches to see they were being accepted, they were being supportive of the company club. So basically, it was a strange rivalry because you had Yaco Barreirense fans, and you had the undercover Barreirense fans who were also appearing as CUF fans as well because they knew where the power lied on. So basically, the success of CUF also comes from the growth, the industrial growth of the region, of course, the talent pool available in the region, and also because it became the symbol of that region, even if most of the supporters didn't want it to be. And that's why the club disappeared in the end, because after the Democratic Revolution in 1974, the company was nationalized like many companies. So they weren't able to hire the best youth players of the area, provide them with contracts, because now it was the state was doing that, and the state didn't pay it as well as they did. So basically, they didn't have a core of support because everyone around supported Barreirense. So basically, they found themselves without the financial backers of the regime and without support from the people around. So basically, that was one of the reasons that the club disappeared from day to night, basically.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I was actually going to mention is that within Barreirense, you've also got all of these other clubs which had been around for a much longer amount of time. Clubs that were entrenched in their communities, clubs that had identities and that local people actually went out to support. So, of course, and this is where you get these different dynamics and sort of different layers of context that we need to talk about, especially when we discuss football within fascist countries, is that you had this football club that was founded to be a works team, but was actually bankrolled by the owner, who was effectively trying to get into the good books of Salazar, the dictator. But then you had people who were somewhat afraid to go along to their own club because they knew they would be repressed by the police and by the regime. So they would go on to support this other club instead. And it kind of almost creates this facade of success and support because of all these different elements. And I think that's quite a fascinating insight as well, is that while Kuf may have seemed quite successful, and in many ways they were, of course, getting to, I think it was a third place finish within the Portuguese top flight for a club from Barreirense is very, very impressive. And I doubt it's something that will ever happen again, but it's almost like this facade of success because a lot of the people who followed the club didn't actually support them. They were just going along so that they were seen to be cooperating almost so that they didn't suffer repression. And that's horrible within itself because you've got people living under this dictatorial regime and as people from other countries may look at that and think, well, they could have done something, but ultimately it's not something that we will have experienced. So, it's entirely different. But, through their history, was around 40 years or so, despite them being quite a strong team and being able to poach all of this talent from around the area and different parts of Portugal, they didn't actually win anything, which I found quite fascinating. They didn't actually get as successful as they probably wanted to be. And I think that's quite fascinating as well, because normally when we hear about these kind of clubs that have been bankrolled, even back in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, they would more often than not win at least a cup here and there, So it's quite interesting that they didn't actually manage to win anything. And I just wondered if you'd managed to find why that was. Did their success and their ability to poach talent fluctuate quite a bit along with political events that were happening within Portugal at the time, or was it just a case that they were aiming really high but just never managed to quite make it?
Well, it's a mix of both, really, like it usually is. Basically, the idea behind KUF was to create a sporting team that would compete for the title, and that's all too well. But as we talked before, Portugal has been dominated from almost its inception by three clubs: Benfica, Sporting from Lisbon, and Porto from the northern city of Porto. So basically, to enter that small world of competitors for the league was really hard. Belenenses was able to do that for a long time. Then Boavista came along. Now we have Braga, but it's very difficult, and that's why, for instance, Braga has been competing and playing Champions League football, never won the league over the past 15 years. That's why Boavista only won it once. That's also why Belenenses, who competed for the league for several seasons on a row, only won it once, because it's very difficult to topple those three clubs. And at the same time, there was a political issue that was of great relevance. Kuf tried to take the pool of players from the region that was full of talented players. But Benfica, Sporting, and later Porto were tapping from another pool of great players that Portugal had at the time, which was Africa. Basically, Portugal had the colonial empire in Africa from Angola, Mozambique, and players were coming from there, from the colonies, to play for the big teams in the city. They didn't care for a contract at KUF because when they were tapped in Africa, they were directly tapped by the main clubs. And all of those main clubs also had important backers. They may not be the richest man in the land like Alfredo Silva was, but they were bankers, they were businessmen. So Benfica, Sporting, and Porto had the prestige. They had the most supporters, of course. They had the ability to play for the title, to enter European competitions from the 15s onwards. And when they started to create variations of their own football clubs inside the colonies. There were a Benfica team in Mozambique, there was a Benfica team in Angola, so they started to tap from the players. And one of those players, of course, was Eusebio, which is probably the best African player ever and one of the best players from the history of Portugal. But there were also a lot of talented players that came from those two countries, essentially, and that changed completely the landscape of Portuguese football, because players coming from Africa had more speed, had more power, had more technical skill from the players from Portugal of the day. So basically, they really made a difference. So teams like CUF weren't able to get those kind of players because there was no need for them to sign for a club of these characteristics. They're always going to move to Lisbon or to Porto, the more cosmopolitan cities, the clubs who paid more, because CUF paid really well, but Benfica's Porto and Porto didn't pay not as bad as they would hope them to be. So basically, that toppled the balance of scales in favor of those big threes once again. So taking in consideration the importance of African football in Portuguese league during the 1950s, 60s onwards, and taking also in consideration that there was also a lot of shadow play around Salazar. Not only Alfredo Silva, but other businessmen want to keep a high profile and were supporters of Benfica, were supporters of Sporting, were supporters of Porto and Belenenses. It became like a Game of Thrones, basically, between all those sporting clubs. So CUF really competed really well because they came from a city that didn't exist at the beginning of the century, basically. So it was a shanty town. So to be able to finish third, finish fourth, there were a lot of the seasons they played against Porto and they won. They won matches against Benfica, they won matches against Sporting, so they were competitive, but they didn't have the strength to go all the way, and they were really unlucky sometimes in cup runs. There was 2 or 3 seasons that they were able to reach the semifinals, but then at the last minute they always lost, and they never were able to play a cup final as well, as Vitória Setúbal, for instance, would play several finals in a row during that same time. But they did won the Intertoto Cup when it was a non-official competition. They did play European football. They did beat teams like AC Milan, an AC Milan that had been European champion 2 years prior. So it was a great team with Rivera, with Maldini, with Trapattoni, with Altafini, and they beat them at home. And basically, those wins during the 60s also helped to keep the club being supported by the locals, because Portuguese supporters, there's not a localism in Portuguese football as there is in England, in Scotland, in Germany, in the Netherlands. So people crave for success. And when CUF started to compete in the first division in 1955, and during those first years started to get high positions on the table, then start to play European football, people from around really fancied supporting them because they believed they were supporting a winning project. Nobody would expect the regime to end. People always lived in the idea that Portugal would stay like that forever, so they wanted to be on the good side of the regime as well. But since CUF was being such a competitive team, they also thought that supporting CUF would be supporting a future winning project, that someday they would be able to win a cup or to win a league because all the conditions were there. And that's why the club was well supported until the right end, until 74. But that's also why they were never able to go a step higher and to fight for the league title, as Belenenses, for instance, did during those days.
That's really interesting. Of course, one of the elements of Portuguese football was when Portugal had its empire and its colonies, as you said, Miguel, there were effectively feeder clubs for Benfica, Porto, and Sporting in different parts of Portugal's empire. And I think actually the club that Eusebio was signed for was like Sporting Club, Mozambique or something
Yes.
along those lines, as I remember reading. And of
Yeah.
course, there's the famous story of him coming over and Sporting wanted to sign him, and then a taxi driver, heard about it and things, and then he ended up going to Benfica. So it's a really, really fascinating story. But of course, there is this other element of Portugal's colonial empire, and I suppose what's interesting from my perspective is that this is where the sort of history and the sort of community roots and identity and heritage of a club has really sort of paid off in this instance. Is that CUF, although they did manage to become successful by being able to pull from this all this talent and having the money to do so, is that they didn't have the history, they didn't have the prestige, as you said, I think is a good word, of Benfica, of Sporting,
Yeah.
and ultimately that's why they were never ever able to win a title or a trophy of any kind, because they didn't have that history. And I think, it's quite relevant to the Red Bull clubs of today and all these other clubs that are bankrolled, is that you can only go so far by throwing money at a team and expecting it to stick. But if you don't have a history, and if you struggle to create a history, and it's very evident you're just there because there's money, then you're struggling to going to make it as a football club in the end.
Yeah, basically, it's like expecting, for instance, Girona to compete for the Spanish league, and of course, we're talking about a club that belongs to the City Group now, a club that has only played 5 seasons in the first division in the whole of its history, and is a club that is also really unknown to Spanish supporters. They are never used to see Girona play in the first and the second division. Their history is mainly playing on the lower leagues. And then you have the backing of an important group like the City Group, and suddenly you have this football club from nowhere playing not only in the league but playing Champions League football. So you have to take that in consideration. You have to create your heritage. You have to be able to do that for decades until you get recognition, and that's what KUF was trying to do, because when they were formed, it was 1937, of course, but they only got promoted for the second time to the first division in 1955. So basically, when the revolution came, they were all starting their second decade playing in the elite. So 2 decades, it's not a long
No.
time to create your legacy. And probably the people who own the company were starting to think, okay, we're going to start a new period now. We're still able to tap great players. When they were disbanded, the season before, they qualified for European football, so they were really competitive. And since nobody expected the regime to end, the project was also to create the roots of a winning team, a team able to compete with the top three. And suddenly, someday, for whatever reason, they will be able to tap on a cup win, tap on a league win, and then start to build from there as well. But time came, the revolution came, and took everyone um, completely out of hand, basically, because nobody expected the movement to succeed how they did. And basically, that was the end of the club, because after that, he was nationalized. Obviously, the Portuguese state, run during those years by left wingers, knew what CUF was all about. The owner of the company was arrested, and he had to flee from Brazil. He only was able to return to Portugal a few years on. So basically, all the players who had contracts, the contracts were cancelled. They were forced to sign for other teams. Many of them became internationals, so they were really a good club in prospect to be. One of them just died recently, Manuel Fernandes, who is a sporting icon. He died a few weeks ago. He's one of the best forwards in the history of Portuguese football, and he was a CUF player until right the end. And he worked for the company as well. He had a contract at least to work for the company as well. And he was the leader of that project, which was full of potential players with future internationals ahead of them. And basically, that's what means to be on the wrong time at the wrong moment. Because if CUF would have been born not in 37, but in 17, and if they had come to the league at the beginning of the 1930s, they will probably be able to create that prestige earlier. So then they will be able to be more competitive in fighting for titles and for honors, like Belenenses did, because Belenenses was a club formed in the early 1920s. And at that time, there was still no national competition. So they became a club used to compete with Benfica and Sporting and the regional leagues. And when the National League came, they were a powerhouse, already renowned, and that's why they were able to be champions in the early 50s.
Yeah, precisely. I think I think you've really hit the nail on the head with that. Actually, as to why the success didn't really come about. I mean, it's probably a bit unfair to say that they had no success whatsoever. That's not entirely true. I think they reached the Portuguese Cup semi final twice, which interestingly, the second time they done it was literally, I think, the season before the revolution happened, and the company was nationalized.
Yeah.
So literally in the twilight of them being bankrolled, they came third place in the Portuguese top flight, as we've already mentioned. They did win the Portuguese second division. That was in 1954. And they also had a couple of runs in the old Intercities Fairs Cup. And what's strange about this one is that they competed in the Intertoto Cup, but of course this was when the Intertoto Cup was broken up into groups, and they won their group. But interestingly, it was in the season after the revolution, so actually they weren't bankrolled. So there's all these different dynamics of the club's success, and I actually think that them having that Intertoto Cup to their name the year after the company was nationalised is a big indication of this story, and quite an interesting point to sort of leave it off, is that money can't always buy you success. But I think saying that they had no success is probably a little bit unfair, but they don't really have anything to show for it. I mean, is it success if you're always coming second or third?
Yeah, no trophy room to show for, of course. It's probably their greatest success is probably not having been relegated since the time they got promoted in 55. because during that period between 55 and 1975, when the regime was toppled and basically they stopped being funded, during those 20 years, a lot of important sides of Portuguese football were relegated, and they always managed to stay up, and not only stay up, but also in the high positions in the league, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. So basically, that was their success because the conditions they had, the history they had behind, the structure of the club, the players they could tap in, probably they couldn't reach for more. And doing so consistently, that's the hard thing because we all know that football is about consistent. You can be you have a spectacular season, you can win the league, and then you can disappear 2 years afterwards because you're not consistent. But if you stay 20 years being fourth, being fifth, being sixth, you're creating a legacy of being okay, a mid-table club, but a top mid-table club, a club that could aspire to something if the right conditions are given. The issue with Kuf is those conditions never came, and then the revolution just did the rest.
Yeah, exactly. And the revolution is obviously the turning point for the club. There's no denying that. They nationalised the company that was bankrolling the club, and therefore their money was essentially pulled from underneath them. It's like you said there, as we know, we've spoken about Gretna, even to an extent, HFC Harlem and some other clubs that had small runs in Europe. These clubs will be bankrolled. They'll win a title or they'll win a cup. They'll play in Europe for a little bit, and then once the money leaves, those clubs fold almost immediately, or they're relegated almost immediately. Whereas Kuf, or the club that has, I suppose, come from Kuf, are still active, though since the company was nationalised, their fortunes have been nowhere near what they used to be. So they were relegated in the 75-76 period. Just after that season, they changed their name, and then they fell into the Setubal, which is, I think at that point wasn't professional. And then it was just kind of relegation after relegation after relegation, and they've really struggled to kind of haul themselves back up to where they once were, haven't they? But it's understandable because they don't have money, they never had an identity, so why are people going to bother following them?
Yeah, basically they changed their name to Kimigal because that was the name the company was given after the revolution. They used it for some time, but then they were also disbanded because there were a couple of years they had no football competition whatsoever. They weren't competing because they went down to the football pyramid, right to the bottom end of the regional leagues of Setúbal where they come from. So from some time they became an amateur club, an official amateur club. Now they are semi-professionals. They have been for quite a few years. They never went as high as the fourth division over the past 2 decades. They usually play between the fourth and the fifth division, and they only had some cup runs to show for. They beat some teams in 2011-12 until they went on to play with Belenenses, who was an historical rival of them. Back in the day, they were great on the last 16. And a few years ago, they played against Porto, which was very iconic because Kuf was also a nightmare for Porto. Porto, when traveling south to play Kuf in the 1560s, lost more than they won. And when Porto went there to play, I think it was 4 or 5 seasons ago for a cup run on the last 32, I suppose, it was an emotional match for many of the long-standing Kuf supporters, the one that remained, which as we talked about, were not many because there was no real heritage when the factory were dismantled. People just moved around for other areas, decided to support other clubs, and basically the people who stayed in Barreiro were also main of them were Barreirense supporters, not CUF supporters. So the ones that remain proven to be our core fans. But of course, like I said before, Portugal has no localism. So basically, every single Portuguese who is not a supporter hardcore from Benfica, Sporting, and Porto, is also a supporter of Benfica, Sporting, and Porto, and another club. So basically, even teams in the first division, there are very few clubs who are able to have hardcore supporters who only support their local club. And when you go down the pyramid, then that's that. So everyone that supports CUF nowadays is also a Benfica supporter, is also a Sporting supporter, Porto supporter. And in the 50s and 60s, that didn't happen. People could have been forced to support CUF instead of Barreirense, but they were supporting their local club. And also, that's an issue with Portuguese football in general. It's a country where, when you go down the football pyramid, it's very hard to come back because, of course, there's no money. Portuguese football has no money. We have a very lack of investment at every level. But there's also not that hardcore local support that can bring you up just by having the locals attending matches, but having local investors investing on the team. For instance, Vitória Setúbal was CUF's greatest rival, and they both played in white and green. CUF kit, by the way, is like Arsenal, but only in green instead of red. And they were rivals during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and they now play in the same division because Setúbal, who historically has been a first division club until 7, 8 years ago, lost all their financial backers and are now also playing the regional leagues. And it's very hard, even for a club of that history, a club that has a club member called Jose Mourinho. A lot of people have even asked him to buy the club just for them to be competitive and to come and coach them. That's the dream of the locals because they know that if that doesn't happen, they will end up disappearing altogether. And Kuf suffer that. Only they didn't had a famous coach to cling to or a famous club member to cling to. So people around there now attend matches at the same stadium that was built in the 50s. It was refurbished, but it's a small stadium to today's standards. They play in the regional league of Setúbal, and they know they cannot aspire to more. So basically, it just became an entertainment on a Saturday afternoon just to go there, see a football match between semi-professional sides of the region, and not aspiring to more than just having fun with your mates.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's quite interesting what you said there about, when you fall down the Portuguese pyramid, it's quite difficult to come back up. It's sort of the same here in Scotland as well. Clubs like, Falkirk and Dunfermline have fallen down as far as the third tier recently, and historically they're very big clubs, but they've been able to claw their way back up more or less to the second tier, because they have historically big fan bases, they have big towns, and they have big identities, and also their constant presences within their communities. But of course, as we've said, the football culture here is a bit different than it is in Portugal, particularly where sort of localism is involved, and they're not necessarily local clubs, but it's kind of that same thing. But not to go off on a bit of a tangent, but do you think that the reason that they've not been able to pull themselves back up is because they've always lacked that identity, and they're basically not able to do it because they've just never been able to create a core fan base because the fan base has existed either through oppression, or because they were forced to, or because they were part of the works team? Do you think that they'll ever be able to come back up in any form, or are they just kind of destined to exist in the amateur form that they're in at the moment?
Well, I think the reason they didn't had a core base is what had them going down in the first place. Because even when the company was nationalized, like you said, they won the Intertoto Cup, they started to lose players progressively. But probably if they had a good core base, they could have spent, I don't know, 5, 10 seasons in the second division, established themselves like a second division side, for instance, and then just waiting for an opportunity to come back. Like I said before, some of the financial backers had to flee during the revolution, some were arrested. But at the beginning of the 1980s, everyone was back in Portugal, everyone was back doing business. So if the club had been back in those days in the second division, who knows if someone of them would just try to buy him back and just trying to make the team competitive again. But since they had no hardcore fans whatsoever during those 4 or 5 years after the revolution, who were very politically tense years, the club just went down and successively. So basically, when people started to look at them again, they were already too much down on the football pyramid. And then after that, it's just a question of money, basically. We have seen over the years how the football pyramid in Portugal is. Like I said, it's very hard to come back. But you have the example of Casa Pia. Casa Pia is a club who is also from the Portuguese 1920s, was also a very small club from Lisbon, but very historical club, a club that was in the first division in the foundational years, a club that had a lot of history. From the first Portuguese national team match was played in Casa Pia's kit. And the captain was a Casa Pia player, so just to see how important they were back in the day. And they also had the same issue that Kuf. They disappeared back in the 1940s because they were considered a left-wing club. So Salazar government stole their stadium directly just to build a highway over it. Didn't have any stadium to play in, didn't have any resources. Casa Pia is also a school for orphans. So basically, they used to tap a lot of the players from the orphanages, and they suddenly started to get less and less public support. So they had the capability of creating a good team. And for almost like 80 years, they were playing the fourth division, they were playing the fifth division. For many, they even had disappeared altogether. And suddenly, a few years ago, an American company just saw where they play at now in Lisbon, and it's a very interesting area in terms of housing bubble. So basically, what they saw was the potential the club had to be playing in a region of a city that is now well famed around the world for its tourism, a city that has all the services, that has an airport, that has a possibility of growing a football club there, and it's also a club that has the history, that has the heritage from their golden past. So they bought the club when they were playing the fourth division, and now they're playing in the first division. And they don't have a stadium. They have been without a stadium for the past 3 seasons because they are refurbishing the old stadium because it had no conditions whatsoever to play professional football. But they are still here because they have the backing and the funding of those American owners. So basically, what can save CUF is to have someone who saw potential in Barreiro, who saw potential with the side. And curiously, there's been reason to be positive about it because there's the possibility of Lisbon to have a new airport is going to be built right next to the industries where Kuf was back in the day. So if that goes on, if the airport is being built, because Lisbon Airport now it's become really small for the amount of travelers it has, they want to create a super airport on the other side of the river that can share a little bit of the burden. If that airport comes through, of course, that will mean a lot for the region. That will bring again development. That will bring again people to live, and probably that could save Kuf. If someone during that process sees a club of that history, sees a club of that potential, and sees that okay, it's good, it's a good opportunity to invest. It's a cheap club to buy. It's a club that has history, that has conditions, so we can invest in them, and we're just trying to climb the ladder once again, like they did with Casapia. It's not a surprise if in 10 years' time we're here sitting saying, well, Kuf is back in the first division. But it has to happen mainly through investment from the outside. No Portuguese financial is going to buy the club. It's probably going to be a foreign owner, like it happened with Casapia. But if it happens, it's the perfect club to buy because it has a lot of heritage, history. Now, if you look back in time, and it is in an area that has no first division football for decades, an area the Steel Belt, who had like 3 or 4 football clubs during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Since the revolution, became almost a club dependent on Stubble, and even Stubble now is playing in the fourth division. So basically, what investors usually look for is a place untapped, a place where they can grow at a market level, and Kuf sits right at the place who can be the next big thing in Portuguese football if conditions are given.
Correct. Yeah. Again, you've hit the nail on the head with all that. There's a lot of factors in that. I just wanted to go back quickly to what you mentioned about Casapia. Of course, they're a very, very historic club. I think, am I right in saying they were kind of formed around an orphanage and something to do with one of the church groups and things like that? And they've always held that identity and the heritage. And no, they've fallen on hard times recently, as you say. They've had this investor, but it's probably fair to say that if they didn't have that investor, then they probably wouldn't be around because they've really struggled for a while.
Yeah.
However, the reason that they've managed to attract an investor is, again, because they have this heritage and they have this history attached to them. And I think even if this American investor didn't step in, someone else would have, because there would be this argument, well, this is one of the most historic clubs, if not the most historic club in Portugal. We can't just let them go defunct.
Yeah, the owners had just bought La Spezia as well, who was Italian champion during the 40s, so it was another club with a lot of
Mm-hmm.
heritage, and that's why Kuf now has the heritage. They didn't have it at a time. At the time when they came, it looks like they didn't have any heritage because they were starting to compete in the first division in '54. So for the people who were living at the time, there were also older clubs playing around. But now, in our present time, they do have the heritage because now we are talking about a club that has been in the first division for almost 30 years, a club that played European football, a club that won against AC Milan. So for investors today in 2024, 25, 26, they look at Kuf and they say, oh, that's a nice club to invest in because they had a lot of history. They played European Cups. So it's interesting because they are seeing it with the eyes of today and not with the eyes of 74 when you just look at a club that's been backed by a regime or at least by financial people connected with the regime that has only been around for 2 or 3 decades.
Yeah, exactly, and that's probably, as you said, where the investment is going to come from. So you can only hope that's what the draw is. But as you mentioned there, we always have to keep on top of all the other developments that are happening around football clubs. If an airport is built next to the area that they're based, it's going to be massive for them. And I suppose, and you know, again, without knowing too much about the landscape of football within Portugal or the area that they're from, if you have loads of clubs condensed in quite a small area, it's always going to be difficult for all of those clubs to garner a support. However, as we say, Barreirense are a very old club and a historic club within their own right. But you would think that if an investor came in, he would potentially look to merge a lot of these clubs together potentially, or even start a new powerhouse within the area, and that's probably going to rub some people up the wrong way as well. So there's always a bit of a tightrope to be walked with this, and there's always a balancing act. There's a lot of plates you need to spin at once and a lot of things that you need to juggle to try and make that
Yeah.
successful. But above all else, it would be a shame if they cease to exist. So you can only hope that some form of investment comes out of there shortly, but not at the not to the detriment of other clubs within the region. Because if Coof end up getting an investor and becoming bankrolled again, then a lot of people would just say, well, this has happened before. This is a repeat of their history. Why are we going to bother?
Yeah, they're the perfect club for people to do it because that's their identity basically, to have a backer that makes them climb the ladder. So basically, if I were an investor, I would say I have the perfect story because this has been done and it has worked out. So why doesn't we do it again?
Yeah, exactly. Just before we finish up, Miguel, is there any other clubs with similar stories that you can think of within Portugal? I mean, this is obviously quite a unique case, but there's a lot of commonalities that we see with other clubs that we've covered, and a lot of clubs in the modern day as well. Was this fairly common with clubs in Portugal during the regime, or are Coof one of the more prominent examples of that happening?
No, Kuf was the main example during the regime because of the importance Alfredo da Silva had within the political structure of Salazar's government. Portuguese football clubs disappearing altogether, it's not really common because people, like I said before, with the absence of localism, people just transform their clubs into amateur clubs or into semi-professional clubs, and they keep on competing even if they are in the fourth, fifth, sixth tier, because basically that's their identity. But there is a club that disappeared recently, and I think it disappeared altogether, that also played in the first division for some seasons. And it's really important in another aspect of the history of the Portuguese game. That is the island of Madeira, of course, the island where Cristiano Ronaldo comes from, and that's União de Madeira. União de Madeira is a club that played in the late 80s to early 90s in the first division. But of course, Madeira is such a small island, and during those times, they had three teams in the first division. Why? Because Portugal had just entered the European Union and they had a regional government. Portugal is a country that only has two regional governments. One is in Madeira, another one is in Azores, which is another archipelago. So basically, the regional government president was also a football fanatic, decided to fund the local clubs so they would be able to compete in the first division. Because Madeira being an island, until the 1970s, they weren't allowed even to compete with the clubs from continental Europe because logistics would have made it really hard for clubs to travel around the island and the continent. So basically, only after the late 70s, they were able to enter the third division, the national third division, then the second division, then they start to climb to the first division. And in the end of the 1980s, all Madeira clubs were playing the first division. And you had clubs with different aspects, clubs who had a Republican ethos like Marítimo. You had clubs who were owned by some of the most local important entrepreneurs like Nacional, which is the club from Cristiano Ronaldo came from, of course. And then you had União de Madeira, was a very traditional club, and of course they didn't have the same backers as Marítimo and Nacional, so they came to the first division. They stayed for a couple of seasons. Then a few seasons on, they came back, but then passing with the years, they disappeared altogether. And funny enough, they were supposed to have disappeared in the 1990s because the regional government of Madeira wanted to create a super club. They wanted to mix the three clubs together and create a club that were able to compete against Benfica, Sporting, and Porto. But they found out the backslash of the local supporters because after so many decades without being able to compete against the teams from the continent, the rivalry between Marítimo, Nacional, and União is huge because they only had to play against themselves for decades. So basically, the project was a sound idea if you think in competitive terms, because if they were the three teams playing the first division, they all obviously were three competitive teams. And if you had only one with the best players of all the teams together, they were playing European football as well. I remember Maritimo played against Leeds United in the UEFA Cup back in 1955. So basically, you could have a team that would challenge for the title. And the idea was good on paper, but then it met with the football identity of supporters. They said no, the project was trashed, and even Maritimo and Nacional went on to be teams would usually compete in European football. Union was not, and basically they were disbanded, I believe, last year.
Yeah, that's right. I think União de Madeira are probably one of, if not the biggest, lost clubs from Portugal, just because of the size when they went defunct. But Madeira is quite an interesting microcosm, if you like, into Portuguese football in itself, because there is a bit of a cultural difference. Of course, even within Portugal, Madeira is seen as being a very, very poor place. A lot of people are in the island are quite insular,
Hmm. Yeah.
and there's a completely different dynamic to it as well. Maritimo and Sede Nacional are the two biggest clubs on the island. probably always will be the case just because of how it is. And it's interesting that the administrators of the island wanted to make a super club because it brings a lot of these themes that we've talked about today and in the podcast together. But the story of Coof is a really, really interesting one, Miguel, and thank you very much for bringing it on the podcast to talk about it. It's absolutely fascinating. And yeah, I think it just really brings a lot of the elements that we've spoken about in other episodes together into one. And again, it's sort of testament to the fact that you can't buy success. Is there anything else that you want to add just before we finish up for today?
Just kudos for you for the project. You know, I'm a big fan, and it was a pleasure for me to be here today with you. I hope to come back to talk about União. I mentioned before there was the logistic excuse, but the real excuse was another one. And just to give a cliffhanger, if we're going to ever record this, basically Madeira was the point where they were trying to make a coup to beat Salazar out of power and reestablish a republican government. So basically, of course, the coup was dismantled. The army invaded the island. Many of the people who were in the coup were connected to the football clubs, were sent to Africa in prisons, basically. And as a sort of punishment, Madeira clubs were outcast from Portuguese football for decades. So basically, that's also a nice story to cling to. But it's also in the book. So basically, if people ever get the chance to read it, they will find that and other stories as well that people really don't know about Portuguese football. That was what brought us together in the first place. How much people really don't know about a country they see so much in the telly or watching European matches or watching the Euros or the World Cups. So basically, it's a fascinating unknown world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're spot on. It's quite undervalued, and you can go digging and find quite a lot. As you said, what we see in of Portuguese football is very face value. But if you go digging, there's so many interesting stories there, and you know, it's very much the story of a country that's had to overcome so much and be resilient to get to the stage they are today in world football. But the other thing that Miguel was subtly trying to tell our listeners there was to buy his book. If you see it, please pick it up, or buy it online so that you can support him. I'm going to do so right after we've had this conversation. And from the chapter that you kindly sent over so that I could do research for this episode, it was very, very good. Once again, Miguel, thank you very much for coming on the show this evening. This has been an excellent conversation, and there's certainly lots for us to follow up on in future and bring some more really, really good episodes to people. So, yeah, thanks once again for coming on. Of course, thank you once again to all of our listeners for joining us tonight. Thank you for your continued support of the podcast. This is, of course, the first episode of our relaunch, so I really hope you've enjoyed it. If you want to see some more content similar to this, you can check us out on X. That's @_footballheritage, and you can also check out our website at footballheritage.co.uk. That's where all of our written content lives. Some really, really brilliant stuff going up there from our contributors, so please do go and have a look at that. Now, if you want to get in touch with us to discuss a topic related to football history or heritage, whether that's lost clubs, former stadiums, playing careers, you name it, anything related to football, identity, culture, club heritage, club histories, you know, get in touch with us and we'll have a chat with you and see if it's something that we can fit in with the project. You can DM us on X, again that's @_footyheritage, or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. As I said, feel free to get in touch and have a chat with us and we'll see what we can do for you. But for now, Miguel, say goodbye.
Bye, and thank you very much for having me, and hope to see you again soon.
And it's goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.